Hi, this is Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. This is the final episode of 6, looking at the Commission's second quarter recommendations to Congress. In the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, the Congress established the National Security Commission on AI to consider the methods and means necessary to integrate artificial intelligence into the national security and defense needs of the United States. In this episode, I spoke with NSCAI's Commissioner Gilman Louie about great power competition in the digital age and the U.S. need for a more technologically literate diplomatic corps to counter China's increasing diplomatic efforts on the technology front. I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. If you could introduce yourself, Gilman, that'd be great.
My name is Gilman Louie. I'm a commissioner for the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I'm also a venture capitalist in the San Francisco Bay Area for Alsop Louie Partners.
Great. And a lot of this second quarter recommendations, particularly in your line of effort, address the great power competition in the digital age, particularly with China. Can you talk a little bit about the stakes here and China's increasing diplomatic efforts on the technology front?
I think the stakes are very high right now and will continue to grow. The world is going through a transition right now. Some would label it the fourth industrial revolution based on information, artificial intelligence, ubiquitous communications like 5G. And that will have great impact across societies and countries and have a global impact, economic impact, social impact. And the Chinese view that it is important not just to be a participant in setting the frameworks for that next industrial revolution, but to be a leader in that industrial revolution. As China becomes increasingly participatory on the global front, they see the U.S. as a competitor, and they don't just aspire to be a U.S. peer. The Chinese aspire to be in the leadership pole position. And what's at risk between the U.S. and China in this great competition is both the values that overlay that technology and the trustworthiness of the technology being deployed on a global level, that it supports and continues to enable the kinds of freedom of information, the right to privacy, and the security of that data that transits across that information knowledge network. So stakes are high. It's important, and the Chinese are about ready to release their new plan on standards. This is one of many plans the Chinese have announced over the last 5 or 6 years to discuss things like the importance of AI, where they set in the technology stack, to 5G, to smart cities. China really looks at this digital revolution as critical to the success of their country.
That's right. And the model that their technology supports is an authoritarian model. And given their economic success, democracy is no longer perceived as the only viable path to economic prosperity and sustainable governance. So the challenge is that they're developing a bloc that's following their model. We have a bloc that's following our model. Can those two blocs coexist?
Let's first talk about the two blocks and then talk about where we can coexist and where there's potential friction. And we have to work hard to make sure that friction doesn't create a situation where countries are putting at risk each other's economic well-being. A simplistic view, but an important view, is the West holds democracy, individuality, the rights to privacy and freedom of speech as high priorities for nation states that are in the democratic world. Those are our values. The Chinese value stability and security. They, as a country, have been around for 3,000 years, and they view that that's a higher precedence than those other values that we have in the West. There is nothing wrong with having countries like China feeling that the line between civil development and military development should be blurred. Chinese have a law, actually multiple laws, that clearly states that nation-state interests outweigh commercial and individual interests. The whole civil military fusion laws that were passed are all designed to make that very, very clear. And for their society, that's the way they view how to grow a great country. That's different than ours. And so as they become more prevalent on the global stage, not just being a regional power, but being a global power and being competitive with the US, those worldviews rub up against each other. Sometimes it's okay to have competition. The competition leads to positive results for all of mankind. Let's compete in things like science and discovery and finding medicines and helping famine and dealing with things like climate and the environmental issues. That's all goodness. Even at a company level, where companies are fairly competing with each other to provide consumers with better and better products. There's nothing wrong with that. The challenge comes when those values begin to bleed over into each other's systems. If you're depending on technology where that technology collects information because it's appropriate for that country so that their security apparatus can track their citizens and what they're saying and what they're doing and their attitudes, that might be okay for their countries and their citizens. Not okay that technology is doing the same thing in the West. It is not okay to have systems that have major security vulnerabilities where those vulnerabilities are not transparent and corrected immediately as they're discovered. We, the other 5/6 of the world, need to make it very clear that if China wants to deploy their technologies and have strong positions in the standards, that they adhere to the norms that have been laid out by the countries who are going to use those technologies.
Beyond general principles, are there actual technology standards that can be set and adhered to? On the camera issue, a lot of the problem has been unsecured S3 buckets, which is an Amazon product, or Elasticsearch data stores that is also a US product. Everyone knows when you have an S3 bucket that you should secure it, but a lot of people don't. How do you encode that in a standard?
The difference is when you run across a flaw, do you patch it? Do you make it widely known? What's your policy on communications of those vulnerabilities? What's your attitude towards fixing those vulnerabilities? American-led companies, though imperfect, work really hard in making sure that vulnerabilities are transparent. They have things like bounties that help enlist third parties and individuals to actually improve quality. There's a real commitment to that quality. But it goes beyond just quality. It's making sure you have open architecture. So you have a fair and level playing field that many participants can play in, and you're not locked in. One of the big debates right now on equipment, Huawei, no matter how you feel about Huawei equipment, is, are they going to adhere to open standards, or is it going to be proprietary and closed? If it's proprietary and closed, it's much harder to get security visibility inside their technology. And again, different value systems. They value, again, security, and supporting state security is a given in China. They trust their government to run their state-run systems with their personal data. We don't. We have a natural view toward making sure our data stays with us and only appropriate data gets shared with the government. The Europeans are even more concerned than the Americans are. So again, these standards are important. The value systems across the world are different from the different versions and flavors of democracy. But it's really important when a country like China doubles the number of participants in the standard body than you have and vote as a bloc. American participants vote based on their viewpoints as providers of technologies as companies. We, as a country, don't provide subsidies to have all of our companies to vote as a single bloc to set a standard. Nor do we have a similar policy that the Chinese had in 2015 to dominate standards. And we'll see what happens in their 2035 strategic outline and where they want to go with strategies.
Yeah, and that's the China Standards 2035 that they're preparing to release.
Let's take 3GPP, for example. So in the last few years, Chinese companies who are participating has grown, and now they have 110 voting members in 3GPP. And you compare that to US voting members, we have 53. They didn't start with 100, but they are rapidly growing the number of participants. There's nothing wrong with having large numbers of participants. The difference is when those participants vote as a single block on critical votes. The 53 US voting participants all vote based on what they believe is the best view of their technologies and best standards. And American companies don't always agree with each other. We see that regularly. American companies compete with each other, as well as competing with other companies around the world. Chinese companies tend to vote as a bloc. We don't put large subsidies out there for standard bodies as a nation state. Chinese do. The Chinese have direct influence on many of these companies. There are party members in leadership positions on boards. PLA has direct influence on a number of these companies. And again, from the Chinese perspective, there is nothing wrong with that. That's just ingrained in the way they build their businesses. They've had state-owned enterprises for 50, 60 years. We don't. When you start with those frameworks and then you start seeing blocks that look like very well-coordinated voting in standards bodies, that tilting of the scale creates an environment where it isn't about the best technology wins or the best standards wins or things that would encourage an ecosystem. It's designed to favor one nation state's technology over the rest of the world.
You're talking about the third generation partnership project. Does that cover 5G, or will there be a new organization, or is there a new organization for setting standards in 5G? And are the Chinese playing a similar game?
This is the key standards body, right? And of course, there's many other standards bodies, and they all have different effects, and they nibble around the edges, and some are more horizontal than vertical. But the 3GPP is a multi-stakeholder body responsible for 5G standard setting.
And all of the 100-plus members from China are legitimate companies. Is there any effort to stuff the committee? In China, Xiaomi has several other companies that it's cross-invested in that share technology and that sort of thing.
I won't use the word legitimate or not legitimate because it is a style of business that is done in China. There are strong partnerships, cross-investing as a way for them to grow their industry. It's natural for Chinese companies to do that based on the fact that that's the environment they have to operate in. But again, the fact is when you go to a standards body and you have that imprint on how you do business, that rubs up against Western businesses to have a different imprint. And that causes friction in the system. And that friction creates environments where you're going to be less than productive, you're going to be contentious, and you spend a lot of time second guessing each other's intent while you're pushing a particular vector on the standard versus some other ones. So there's not that level of trust, particularly when you vote as blocks. Because at the end of the day, after everybody lays the cards on the table and everybody pushes what their viewpoints are, when it comes time to voting, 110 votes cast consistently as a single vote, whether or not you intend to signal or not, that's a clear signal to the rest of the world that the rest of the world needs to deal with that kind of voting.
The report notes that there's no holistic effort in the U.S. to respond not only to this standard-setting effort, but to the larger program of Chinese influence that includes Belt and Road Initiative, Digital Silk Road, and those sorts of things. Your recommendations address the diplomacy, but it doesn't address the programs that the U.S. diplomats should be pushing. Is there a companion effort in the U.S. to come up with programs to counter Belt and Road or Digital Silk Road? I know the Commission's efforts embody some of those, but can you talk a little bit about that? Those are pretty powerful efforts on the part of the Chinese.
We'll start with the view of whether or not the Chinese programs ultimately will lead to the results that they desired it to lead to. The jury's still out on whether or not their level of investments in the Belt and Road Initiative and their other initiatives are going to have the long-term payoff soft power. It's one thing to help other countries build their economies by augmenting those countries with technology and providing technical support. There's another thing to go into a country with mainly your workforce and contracts to your subcontractors and not really invest in the local economies. China has been highly criticized in their initiatives for helping on one level, putting security cameras into regimes that might use that technology in ways that influence elections. But it's another thing that say, are you really helping small and medium-sized businesses and companies within that country build enough of a critical infrastructure that they can be successful? The Chinese haven't gotten to that point yet. I'm not quite sure they will. The U.S. version, U.S. aid, is always about helping other countries help themselves. That has always been a guiding principle of the United States. And I strongly suspect that will be for off into the future. So again, different cultures, different style of aid. I'm not really enthusiastic by adopting a Chinese approach. If anything, the U.S. should continue to help build strong economies around the world by embracing strong democratic values and help building strong legal systems, IP protection systems. Standards should not favor one country versus another. This should be to the betterment of the technologies helping societies, not to favor one country's companies over somebody else's.
The State Department pushed for new technology protection policies, including mandating a clean path, as the report puts it, for its own 5G network traffic and pushing allies to adopt similar standards. Can you explain what's meant by clean path?
There's a couple of things about clean path. First of all, the path needs to be trusted. From the point of talking through your handset, through the airways, across the base stations, through the fiber, to the cloud, back out to the other side. That path of your information and your data needs to be trusted. It needs to be secure. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to be available. If there's weakness in that system where somebody can be in the middle of that system collecting information, if there's not sufficient redundancy where the system is not reliable, if you cannot assure that not only the person you intended to give the information, but only the person you intended to get the information gets the information, and all the data along the way is protected, then you don't have a clear path. And without that clear path, you cannot rely on those networks for critical infrastructure. Unfortunately, as more and more networks are being deployed around the world, equipment that don't necessarily share the same levels of trust as other pieces of equipment puts those networks at risk.
The second quarter recommendations deal with how the U.S. needs a diplomatic strategy to counter these increasingly aggressive efforts to dominate international technology standard-setting bodies, which in turn spreads an authoritarian approach to artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. Can you talk specifically about a few of the standards that are now being set that are critical to maintaining U.S. dominance in AI and 5G?
We're still early in the 5G development cycle. We're dealing with second and third generations of hardware. There's a limited number of handsets that are in the market. China's moving out more rapidly domestically. The rest of the world is trying to build first generation environments in terms of operating the current generation of technologies. So there's still a lot of work to be done on the 5G side on these standards bodies. 4G evolved from 4G to 4G LTE to 4G LTE plus. And the same thing's going to happen in 5G. We're looking at 5G to run strong for the next 15 plus years. And those standard bodies are going to be active throughout the entire life of 5G. So it's really important that from a diplomacy point of view, that the State Department first becomes literate in discussing things around 5G and be fluent on the issues around AI, because so much of the global information economy is going to have AI built into it. And if you're still making economic arguments without the technology overlay, then your diplomatic corps is going to be significantly underpowered relative to another country who may have very sophisticated technologists like China that has strong engineering and technology roots at its leadership level. Being able to debate with them on critical pieces of technology and cyberspace where you're unable to even field a team that's literate in the topic area.
China's diplomatic corps is involved in providing AI-enabled surveillance systems to developing countries, which speaks to this not only literacy, but the role of the diplomatic corps. How does that happen? You have a Chinese diplomat who accompanies a Chinese company to visit a ministry, or is it China just promoting AI-enabled surveillance to its host government? I can't imagine how that actually happens. I'm wondering if you have any visibility on that.
I don't have personal visibility, but I would say all countries have trade delegations. We have trade delegations. Chinese have trade delegations. German, the Japanese, the Koreans all have trade delegations. And trade delegations usually are a combination of people from industry as well as government officials going to other countries. It's a common tool. On this issue of AI-enabled surveillance, China is the world's largest manufacturer of security cameras. You take a look at SenseTime, which is one of the two big AI companies, actually the most highly valued AI company, that also does smart surveillance cameras and facial recognitions. 35% of their revenues come from security cameras. If you look at the Chinese smart cities, their technologies, Huawei, ZTE, those companies are in over 230 cities worldwide. And they tend to provide nation-state capabilities that help government officials spy on opponents. Whether design or by accident, those technologies are in cities all around the world, and they have immense capabilities, and in the wrong hands could do great harm, or at least from our point of view in the West, violates our sensibilities on how those technologies should be deployed.
A more technologically literate American diplomatic corps would be able to argue the U.S. point of view to governments abroad, or would promote an alternative technology stack.
A good example is what's going on in 5G and who other countries use to build out their infrastructures and what the risks are. Being able to have a diplomatic corps who can engage with another country, explain the risks of using equipment that you may or may not trust in your critical communications and for critical infrastructure are examples where unless you can actually speak to the technology, it's hard to make persuasive arguments. It's just not good enough to say, hey, just because a piece of technology comes from a country of specific origin, like China or perhaps Russia or another country, to explain really what's at risk and how particularly this deployment of this technology create vulnerabilities for a nation state. When you do a bilateral trade deal, to be able to help countries understand the risks on certain provisions of those agreements that may seem kind of geeky on one level, but could have long-lasting implications on another. Setting out what are allowable standards the country should have as they think about the deployment of AI. You want a diplomatic corps who can talk and speak at a technical level of how technology gets affected by that social overlay, down to the kinds of specific AI technology and machine learning technology that you may deploy, and how you should maybe think about making sure that these systems are validated and that they're safe. That requires technical capability and understanding from your diplomats. State Department really wants to do this. They tried in 2019 to create their CSAT Bureau, their Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology Bureau. and get it funded by Congress. They didn't get the support they wanted. And I think it's critical for us as a nation state to support State Department effort to climb that mountain, to have diplomats who are able to articulate these technology issues.
How is it done currently? There is a lot of pressure being brought to bear on allies not to adopt Huawei in their 5G infrastructure, Huawei technology. Without that technologically literate diplomatic corps, is it being done through envoys or through different international bodies? What you're saying is we're missing a critical channel in our effort.
The first time, at least in recent memory, where this came pretty clear was in the whole ICANN debate. We almost got caught flat-footed because we didn't realize the impact if the U.S. let go of ICANN and had ICANN go off to another nation state and lose that control over the domain naming, right? And we caught it. Thank God somebody was paying attention. And then we rallied. We brought experts from various agencies to figure out what we wanted to get done. But that ad hoc approach at getting lucky is not a strategy. On the 5G debate, we lean on expertise from other departments, and the departments help. But there is no substitute from having the person in the room, your diplomat in the room, having direct knowledge versus having can you guys hang on? Let me go check back in my home office. Let me study this. When your potential competitor is on the other side of that table, who's clearly articulate in the issues, who clearly understands where the touch points are and knows how to push their viewpoints and their message points across to the other side to influence not just standards, but adoptions of technologies.
For listeners, ICANN, can you define that?
During the issue on who controls the name domain registration for the internet, this took place many years ago. The State Department wasn't really following those issues very closely. And the Chinese and other nation states clearly saw this as an opportunity to move this out of the U.S., and we almost missed it.
The Commission's recommending training. How long do you think it will take before we can field a technologically literate diplomatic corps?
It doesn't happen overnight. It starts with one diplomat at a time. Having the Cyber Bureau, Emerging Tech Bureau stood up and appropriately staffed and funded will give us an ability to immediately bring expertise to bear. We are also recommending in our report leveraging our federally funded research and development centers and our university research centers' expertise, as well as establishing more expert boards that the State Department can draw on. I think it's the combination of those layers as we climb that mountain of technical proficiency and literacy that's going to help us be able to hit the ground running, so to speak. The State Department, the diplomatic corps, are very committed Americans doing the best they can with the tools they got. And they need help. They need those training programs. It's not like you can just take one class or go on to your computer and a 1-hour course and you're going to be immediately literate. Even if you're engaged in the practice of these technologies move very swiftly. There are new developments literally daily, and unless you have experts to stay on top of that, and diplomats who are able to talk to those experts and be able to understand the points they're trying to make and translate that into diplomatic action, it becomes very, very difficult to be able to set these kinds of agendas and to be able to have this kind of dialogue on a global level, whether it's bilaterally or multilaterally or on a global standards body.
Beyond broad literacy within the diplomatic corps, the Commission is recommending a high-level bureau within the State Department that can coordinate diplomatic efforts on global technology and fielding officers from that bureau. Is that bureau different than the CSET that has already been talked about?
This is specifically CSET. We wanted to make sure it gets funded, it gets the level of support. This is a State Department's initiative. We're just saying, please support them. Let's double down. Let's put strong AI expertise in that bureau and make it more than cybersecurity only focus. I think if we do that, State Department will be well served.
And then that bureau would have officers that report into that bureau that are then fielded to diplomatic missions around the world.
Yes, not only that, but also to take our existing diplomatic corps and make them proficient, train them up and make them literate.
And then capitals around the world would have a specific diplomatic officer to handle technology. You also talk about having personnel in technology hubs outside of the consulates and embassies around the world, as well as in Silicon Valley. Sort of eyes and ears for the State Department to keep track of what's happening in the private sector.
It's more than just keeping track. First of all, technologies are built in ecosystems or technology hubs that have strong universities, they have legal support and infrastructure that's technology enabling. It's the investment base that provides the capital. All those pieces need to work together in concert to create these clusters of innovation. And if you're not inside that cluster, you're going to miss it. You're not going to be part of the conversations. You're not going to be able to hear the chatter that takes place in the restaurants, at lunch and at dinners, conversations between government agencies and private companies trying to solve tricky problems, being able to understand where the money is going and where the new opportunities are at. Really difficult to do that from Washington. Somebody once asked, really, do we need yet another government agency? And my response to that is, how can we not have State Department out in these technology hubs? How can we not have the agency that we hope is able to project U.S. democratic interests on a global basis not be involved in the technology centers? If you want to have a seat at the table, you got to be in the room. And in many cases, we're not in the room.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Gilman for his time. If you want to learn more about the National Security Commission on AI, visit their website at nscai.gov. If you want to share your views on AI and national security, reach out to NSCAI at inquiry@nscai.gov. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world, so pay attention.